Hey friends, sorry for not getting this up yesterday. We were making meals for a friend who had surgery, and by the time we were done, it got too late to finish the chapter. So I'm going to finish the second half today and upload it, and I'll also try to upload chapter 11. Thanks, everyone. Hey everyone, welcome to A Chapter a Day Keeps the Fascists Away, where I read history to you so we can figure out what's going on in the United States because things are scary right now. The first book that we're doing in this series is A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We read the first part of Chapter 10 yesterday, so I'm going to pick right back up and we're going to do the second part of Chapter 10 today. All right, so here we go. This chapter is called The Other Civil War. Women shoebinders and stitchers joined the strike and held their own mass meeting. A New York Herald reporter wrote of them, "They assail the bosses in a style which reminds one of the amiable females who participated in the First French Revolution." A huge ladies' procession was organized, the women marching through the streets high with snowdrifts, carrying signs. "American ladies will not be slaves, weak in physical strength, but strong in moral courage. We dare battle for the right, shoulder to shoulder with our fathers, husbands, and brothers." 10 days after that, a procession of 10,000 striking workers, including delegations from Salem, Marblehead, and other towns, men and women, marched through Lynn in what was the greatest demonstration of labor to take place in New England at the time. Police from Boston and militia were sent in to make sure strikers did not interfere with shipments of shoes to be finished out of the state. The strike processions went on while city grocers and provisions dealers provided food for the strikers. The strike continued through March with morale high, but by April it was losing force. The manufacturers offered higher wages to bring the strikers back into the factories, but without recognizing the unions, so that workers still had to face the employer as individuals. Most of the shoe workers were native-born Americans. Alan Dawley says in his study of the Lynn strike, Class and Community, they did not accept the social and political order that kept them in poverty. However, much it was praised in American schools, churches, and newspapers. In Lynn, he says, articulate, activist Irish shoe and leather workers joined Yankees in flatly rejecting the myth of success. Irish and Yankee workers jointly looked for labor candidates when they went to the polls and resisted strike breaking by local force. Trying to understand why this fierce class spirit did not lead to independent revolutionary political action, Dawley concludes that the main reason is the electoral politics drained the energies of the resistors into the channels of the system. Dawley disputes some historians who have said the high rate of mobility of workers prevented them from organizing in revolutionary ways. He says that while there was a high turnover in Lynn too, this masked the existence of a virtually permanent minority who played the key role in organizing discontent. He also suggests that mobility helps people see that others are in similar conditions. He thinks the struggle of European workers for political democracy, even while they sought economic equality, made them class conscious. American workers, however, had already gained political democracy by the 1830s, and so their economic battles could be taken over by political parties that blurred class lines. Even this might not have stopped labor militancy and the rise of class consciousness, Dawley says, if not for the fact that an entire generation was sidetracked in the 1860s because of the Civil War. Northern wage earners who rallied to the Union cause became allied with their employers. National issues took over from class issues. At a time when scores of industrial communities like Lynn were seething with resistance to industrialism, national politics were preoccupied with the issues of war and Reconstruction. And on these issues, the political parties took positions, offered choices, obscured the fact that the political system itself and the wealthy classes it represented were responsible for the problems they now offered to solve. Class consciousness was overwhelmed during the Civil War, both North and South, by military and political unity in the crisis of war. That unity was weaned by rhetoric and enforced by arms. It was a war proclaimed as a war for liberty, but working people would be attacked by soldiers if they dared to strike. Indians would be massacred in Colorado by the U.S. Army, and those daring to criticize Lincoln's policies would be put in jail without trial, perhaps 30,000 political prisoners. Still, there were signs in both sections of dissent from that unity: anger of poor against rich, rebellion against the dominant political and economic forces. In the North, the war brought high prices for food and the necessities of life. Prices of milk, eggs, cheese were up 60 to 100% for families that had not been able to pay the old prices. One historian, Emerson Fite, Social and Industrial Conditions in the North During the Civil War, described the war situation. Employers were wont to appropriate to themselves all or nearly all of the profits accruing from the higher prices, without being willing to grant to the employees a fair share of these profits through the medium of higher wages. There were strikes all over the country during the war. The Springfield Republican in 1863 said that the workmen of almost every branch of trade have had their strikes within the last few months, and the San Francisco Evening Bulletin said striking for higher wages is now the rage among the working people of San Francisco. Unions were being formed as a result of these strikes. Philadelphia shoemakers in 1863 announced that high prices made organization imperative. The headline in Fincher's Trades Review of November 21st, 1863, The Revolution in New York, was an exaggeration, but its list of labor activities was impressive evidence of the hidden resentments of the poor during the war. The upheaval of the laboring masses in New York has started the capitalists of that city and vicinity. The machinists are making a bold stand. We publish their appeal in another column. The city railroad employees struck for higher wages and made the whole population for a few days ride on Shank's mare. The house painters of Brooklyn have taken steps to counteract the attempt of the bosses to reduce their wages. The house carpenters, we are informed, are pretty well out of the woods, and their demands are generally complied with. The safe makers have obtained an increase of wages and are now at work. The lithographic printers are making efforts to secure better pay for their labor. The workmen on the ironclads are yet holding out against the contractors. The window shade painters have obtained an advance of 25%. The horseshoers are fortifying themselves against the evils of money and trade fluctuations. The sash and blind makers are organized and ask their employees for 25% additional. The sugar packers are remodeling their list of prices. The glass cutters demand 15% to present wages. Imperfect as we confess our list to be, there is enough to convince the reader that the social revolution now working its way through the land must succeed if working men are only true to each other. The stage drivers, to the number of 800, are on strike. The working men of Boston are not behind, in addition to the strike at the Charlestown Navy Yard. The riggers are on strike. At this writing, it is rumored, says the Boston Post, that a general strike is contemplated among the workmen in the iron establishments at South Boston and other parts of the city. The war brought many women into shops and factories, often over the objections of men who saw them driving wage scales down. In New York City, girls sewed umbrellas from 6 in the morning to midnight, earning $3 a week, from which employers deducted the cost of needles and thread. Girls who made cotton shirts received 24 cents for a 12-hour day. In late 1863, New York working women held a mass meeting to find a solution to their problems. A working women's protective union was formed, and there was a strike of women umbrella workers in New York and Brooklyn. In Providence, Rhode Island, a ladies' cigar makers union was organized. Altogether, by 1864, about 200,000 workers, men and women, were in trade unions, forming national unions in some of the trades, putting out labor newspapers. Union troops were used to break strikes. Federal soldiers were sent to Cold Springs, New York, to end a strike at a gunworks where workers wanted a wage increase. Striking machinists and tailors in St. Louis were forced back to work by the Army. In Tennessee, a Union general arrested and sent out of the state 200 striking mechanics. When engineers on the Reading Railroad struck, troops broke that strike, as they did with the miners in Tioga County, Pennsylvania. White workers of the North were not enthusiastic about a war which seemed to be fought for the black slave or for the capitalist, for anyone but them. They worked in semi-slave conditions themselves. They thought the war was profiting the new class of millionaires. They saw defective guns sold to the army by contractors and sold as sugar, rye sold as coffee, shop sweepings made into clothing and blankets, paper sold shoes produced for soldiers at the front, Navy ships made of rotting timbers, soldiers' uniforms that fell apart in the rain. The Irish working people of New York, recent immigrants, poor, looked upon with contempt by Native Americans, could hardly find sympathy for the black population of the city, who competed with them for the jobs as longshoremen, barbers, waiters, domestic servants. Blacks pushed out of these jobs often were used to break strikes. Then came the war, the draft, the chance of death, and the Conscription Act of 1863 provided that the rich could avoid military service. They could pay $300 or buy a substitute. In the summer of 1863, a song of the conscripts was circulated by the thousands in New York and other cities. One stanza. We're coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more. We leave our homes and firesides with bleeding hearts and sore. Since poverty has been our crime, we bow to thy decree. We are the poor and have no wealth to purchase liberty. When recruiting for the army began in July of 1863, a mob in New York wrecked the main recruiting station. Then for 3 days, crowds of white workers marched through the city, destroying buildings, factories, streetcars, lines, homes. The draft riots were complex: anti-black, anti-rich, anti-Republican. From an assault on draft headquarters, the rioters went on to attacks on wealthy homes, then to the murder of blacks. They marched through the streets, forcing factories to close, recruiting more members of the mob. They set the city's colored orphan asylum on fire. They shot, burned, and hanged blacks they found in the streets. Many people were thrown into the rivers to drown. On the fourth day, Union troops returning from the Battle of Gettysburg came into the city and stopped the rioting. Perhaps 400 people were killed. No exact figures have ever been given, but the number of lives lost was greater than in any other incident of domestic violence in American history. Joel Tyler Headley, The Great Riots of New York, gave a graphic day-by-day description of what happened. Second day, the fire bells continually ringing increased the terror that every hour became more widespread. Especially was this true of the Negro population. At one time, there lay on the corner of 27th Street and 7th Avenue the dead body of a Negro, stripped nearly naked, and around it a collection of Irishmen absolutely dancing or shouting like wild Indians. A Negro barber's shop was next attacked, and the torch applied to it. A Negro lodging house in the same street next received the visit of these furies, and was soon a mass of ruins. Old men, 70 years of age, and young children, too young to comprehend what it all meant, were cruelly beaten and killed. There were anti-draft riots, not so prolonged or bloody, in other northern cities: Newark, Troy, Boston, Toledo, Emmonsville. In Boston, the dead were Irish workers attacking an armory who were fired on by soldiers. In the South, beneath the apparent unity of the white Confederacy, there was also conflict. Most whites, 2/3 of them, did not own slaves. A few thousand families made up the plantation elite. The federal census of 1850 showed that 1,000 Southern families at the top of the economy received about $50 million a year in income, while all the other families, about 660,000, received $60 million a year. Millions of Southern whites were poor farmers, living in shacks or abandoned outhouses, cultivating land so bad the plantation owners had abandoned it. Just before the Civil War in Jackson, Mississippi, slaves working in a cotton factory received 20 cents a day for board, and white workers at the same factory received 30 cents. A newspaper in North Carolina in August 1855 spoke of hundreds of thousands of working-class families existing upon half-starvation from year to year. Behind the rebel battle yells and the legendary spirit of the Confederate Army, there was much reluctance to fight. A sympathetic historian of the South, E. Merton Coulter, said, why did the Confederacy fail? The forces leading to defeat were many, but they may be summed up by this one fact. The people did not will hard enough and long enough to win. Not money or soldiers, but willpower and morale were decisive. The conscription law of the Confederacy, too, provided that the rich could avoid service. Did Confederate soldiers begin to suspect that they were fighting for the privileges of an elite that they could never belong to? In April 1863, there was a bread riot in Richmond. That summer, draft riots occurred in various southern cities. In September, a bread riot in Mobile, Alabama. Georgia Lee Tatum, in her study Disloyalty in the Confederacy, writes, before the end of the war, there was much dissatisfaction in every state, and many of the disloyal had formed into bands, in some states into well-organized, active societies. The Civil War was one of the first instances in the world of modern warfare: deadly artillery shells, Gatling guns, bayonet charges, combining the indiscriminate killing of mechanized war with hand-to-hand combat. The nightmare scenes could not adequately be described except in a novel like Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. In one charge before Petersburg, Virginia, a regiment of 850 Maine soldiers lost 632 men in half an hour. It was a vast butchery, 623,000 dead on both sides, and 471,000 wounded. Over 1 million dead and wounded in a country whose population was 30 million. No wonder that desertions grew among Southern soldiers as the war went on. As for the Union Army, by the end of the war, 200,000 had deserted. Still, 600,000 had volunteered for the Confederacy in 1861, and many in the Union Army were volunteers. The psychology of patriotism, the lure of adventure, the aura of moral crusade created by political leaders, worked effectively to dim class resentments against the rich and powerful, and turn much of the angst against the enemy. As Edmund Wilson put in Patriotic War, written after World War II, we have seen in our most recent years how a divided and arguing public opinion may be converted overnight into a national near unanimity, an obedient flood of energy which will carry the young to destruction and overpower any effort to stem it. The unanimity of men at war is like that of a school of fish, which will swerve simultaneously and apparently without leadership when the shadow of an enemy appears, or like a sky-darkening flight of grasshoppers, which also, all compelled by impulse, will descend to consume the crops. Under the deafening noise of the war, Congress was passing and Lincoln was signing into law a whole series of acts to give business interests what they wanted, and what the agrarian South had blocked before secession. The Republican platform of 1860 had been a clear appeal to businessmen. Now Congress in 1861 passed the Morrill Tariff. This made foreign goods more expensive, allowed American manufacturers to raise their prices, and forced American consumers to pay more. The following year, a Homestead Act was passed. It gave 160 acres of western land, unoccupied and publicly owned, to anyone who would cultivate it for 5 years. Anyone willing to pay $1.25 an acre could buy a homestead. Few ordinary people had the $200 necessary to do this. Speculators moved in and bought up much of the land. Homestead land added up to 50 million acres. But during the Civil War, over 100 million acres were given by Congress and the President to various railroads free of charge. Congress also set up a national bank, putting the government into partnership with the banking interests, guaranteeing their profits. With strikes spreading, employers pressed Congress for help. The contract labor law of 1864 made it possible for companies to sign contracts with foreign workers whenever the workers pledged to give 12 months of their wages to pay the cost of emigration. This gave the employers during the Civil War not only very cheap labor, but strike breakers. More important, perhaps, than the federal laws passed by Congress for the benefit of the rich were the day-to-day operations of local and state laws for the benefit of landlords and merchants. Gustavus Myers, in his History of the Great American Fortunes, comments on this in discussing the growth of the Astor family's fortune, much of it out of the rents of New York tenements. It is not murder when, compelled by want, people are forced to fester in squalid, germ-filled tenements, where the sunlight never enters and where disease finds a prolific breeding place. Oh, is it not murder? Excuse me. Untold thousands went to their deaths in these unspeakable places. Yet, so far as the law was concerned, the rents collected by the Astors, as well as by other landlords, were honestly made. The whole institution of law saw nothing out of the way in these conditions, and very significantly so, because, to repeat over and over again, law did not represent the ethics or ideals of advanced humanity. It exactly reflected, as a pool reflects the sky, the demands and self-interest of the growing propertied class. In the 30 years leading up to the Civil War, the law was increasingly interpreted in the courts to suit the capitalist development of the country. Studying this, Morton Horwitz, The Transformation of American Law, points out that the English common law was no longer holy when it stood in the way of business growth. Mill owners were given the legal right to destroy other people's property by flood to carry on their business. The law of eminent domain was used to take farmers' land and give it to canal companies or railroad companies as subsidies. Judgments for damages against businessmen were taken out of the hands of juries, which were unpredictable, and given to judges. Private settlement of disputes by arbitration was replaced by court settlements, creating more dependence on lawyers, and the legal profession gained in importance. The ancient idea of a fair price for goods gave way in the courts to the idea of a caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, thus throwing generations of consumers from that time to the mercy of the businessmen. The contract law was intended to discriminate against working people and for business is shown by Horwitz in the following example of the early 19th century. The court said that if a worker signed a contract to work for a year and left before the year was up, he was not entitled to any wages, even for the time he had worked. But the courts at the same time, said that if a building business broke a contract, it was entitled to be paid for whatever had been done up until that point. The pretense of the law was that a worker in a railroad made a contract with equal bargaining power. Thus, a Massachusetts judge decided an injured worker did not deserve compensation because by signing the contract, he was agreeing to take certain risks. The circle was completed. The law had come simply to ratify those forms of inequality that the market system produced. It was a time when the law did not even pretend to protect working people, as it would in the next century. Health and safety laws were either non-existent or unenforced. In Lawrence, Massachusetts, in 1860, on a winter day, the Pemberton Mill collapsed, with 900 workers inside, mostly women. 88 died, and although there was evidence that the structure had never been adequate to support the heavy machinery inside, and that this was known to the construction engineer, a jury found no evidence of criminal intent. Horowitz sums up what happened in the courts of law by the time of the Civil War. By the middle of the 19th century, the legal system had been reshaped to the advantage of men of commerce and industry at the expense of farmers, workers, consumers, and other less powerful groups within the society. It actively promoted a legal redistribution of wealth against the weakest groups in the society. In pre-modern times, the maldistribution of wealth was accomplished by simple force. In modern times, exploitation is disguised as it is accomplished by law, which has the look of neutrality and fairness. By the time of the Civil War, modernization was well underway in the United States. With the war over, the urgency of national unity slackened, and ordinary people could turn more to their daily lives, their problems of survival. The disbanded armies were now in the streets looking for work. In June of 1865, Fincher's Trades Review reported, as was to be expected, the returned soldiers are flooding the streets already, unable to find employment. The cities to which the soldiers returned were death traps of typhus, tuberculosis, hunger, and fire. In New York, 100,000 people lived in the cellars of the slums. 12,000 women worked in houses of prostitution to keep from starving. The garbage, lying 2 feet deep in the streets, was alive with rats. In Philadelphia, while the rich got fresh water from the Schuylkill River, everyone else drank from the Delaware, into which 13 million gallons of sewage were dumped every day. In the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, the tenements fell so fast, one after another, that people said it sounded like an earthquake. A movement for the 8-hour day began among working people after the war, helped by the formation of the First National Federation of Unions, a national labor union. A 3-month strike of 100,000 workers in New York won the 8-hour day, and at a victory celebration in June 1872, 150,000 workers paraded through the city. The New York Times wondered what proportion of the strikers were thoroughly American. Women brought into industry during the war organized unions: cigar makers, tailoresses, umbrella sewers, cap makers, printers, laundresses, shoe workers. They formed the Daughters of St. Crispin and succeeded in getting the Cigar Makers Union and the National Typographical Union to admit women for the first time. A woman named Gussie Lewis of New York became corresponding secretary of the Typographers Union. But the cigar makers and typographers were only 2 of the 30-odd national unions, and the general attitude toward women was one of exclusion. In 1869, the collar laundresses of Troy, New York, whose work involved standing over the washtub over the ironing table, with furnaces on either side, the thermometer averaging 100 degrees for wages averaging $2 and $3 a week, according to a contemporary account, went on strike. Their leader was Kate Mullaney, second vice president of the National Labor Union. 7,000 people came to a rally to support them, and the women organized a cooperative collar and cuff factory to provide work and keep the strike going. But as time went on, outside support dwindled. The employers began making a paper collar requiring fewer laundresses. The strike failed. The dangers of mill work intensified efforts to organize. Work often went on around the clock. At a mill in Providence, Rhode Island, fire broke out one night in 1866. There was panic among the 600 workers, mostly women, and many jumped to their deaths from upper-story windows. In Fall River, Massachusetts, women weavers formed a union independent of the men weavers. They refused to take a 10% wage cut that the men had accepted, struck against 3 mills, won the men's support, and brought a halt to 3,500 looms and 156,000 spindles, with 3,200 workers on strike. But their children needed food. They had to return to work, signing an ironclad oath, later called a Yellow Dog Contract, not to join a union. Black workers at this time found the National Labor Union reluctant to organize them, so they formed their own unions and carried on their own strikes, like the levee workers in Mobile, Alabama in 1867, Negro longshoremen in Charleston, dock workers in Savannah. This probably stimulated the National Labor Union at its 1869 convention to resolve to organize women and Negroes, declaring that it recognized neither color nor sex on the question of the rights of labor. No shit. Anyway, a journalist wrote about the remarkable signs of racial unity at this convention. When a native Mississippian and an ex-Confederate soldier, in addressing a convention, refers to a colored delegate who has preceded him as the gentleman from Georgia, when an ardent and democratic partisan from New York at that declares that a rich Irish brogue that he asks for himself no privilege as a mechanic or as a citizen that he is not willing to concede to every other man, white or black, then one may indeed be warranted in asserting the time works curious changes. Most unions, however, still kept Negroes out or asked them to form their own locals. The National Labor Union began to expend more and more of its energy on political issues, especially currency reform, a demand for the issuance of paper money, greenbacks. As it became less an organizer of labor struggles and more a lobbyist with Congress concerned with voting, it lost vitality. An observer of the labor scene, F.A. Sorge, wrote in 1870 to Karl Marx in England, "The National Labor Union, which had such brilliant prospects in the beginning of its career, was poisoned by greenbackism and is slowly but surely dying. Perhaps unions could not easily see the limits to legislative reform in an age when such reform laws were being passed for the first time and hopes were high. The Pennsylvania legislature in 1869 passed a Mine Safety Act providing for the regulation and ventilation of mines and for the protection of the lives of miners. Only after 100 years of continuing accidents in those mines would it be understood how insufficient those words were, except as a device to calm anger among miners. In 1873, another economic crisis devastated the nation. It was the closing of the banking house of J. Cook, the banker who during the war had made $3 million a year in commissions alone for selling government bonds that started the wave of panic. While President Grant slept in Cook's Philadelphia mansion on September 18, 1873, the banker rode downtown to lock the door on his bank. Now people could not pay loans on mortgages, 5,000 businesses closed and put their workers on the street. It was more than J. Cook. The crisis was built into a system which was chaotic in its nature, in which only the very rich were secure. It was a system of periodic crisis, 1837, 1857, 1873, and later 1893, 1907, 1919, 1929, that wiped out small businesses and brought cold, hunger, and death to working people, while the fortunes of the Astors, Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Morgans kept growing through the war and peace, crisis, and recovery. During the 1873 crisis, Carnegie was capturing the steel market. Rockefeller was wiping out his competitors in oil. Labor depression in Brooklyn was the headline in the New York Herald in November 1873. It listed closings and layoffs, a felt skirt factory, a picture frame factory, a glass cutting establishment, a steelworks factory, and women's trades, milliners, dressmakers, shoebinders. The Depression continued through the 1870s. During the first 3 months of 1874, 90,000 workers, almost half of them women, had to sleep in police stations in New York. They were known as revolvers because they were limited to 1 or 2 days a month at any one police station, and so had to keep moving. All over the country, people were evicted from their homes. Many roamed the cities looking for food. Desperate workers tried to get to Europe or to South America. In 1878, the SS Metropolis, filled with laborers, left the United States for South America and sank with all aboard. The New York Tribune reported, 1 hour after the news that the ship had gone down arrived in Philadelphia, the office of Messrs. Collins was besieged by hundreds of hunger-bitten, decent men begging for the places of the drowned laborers. Mass meeting and demonstrations of the unemployed took place all over the country. Unemployed councils were set up. A meeting in New York at Cooper Institute in late 1873, organized by trade unions and the American section of the First International, founded in 1864 in Europe by Marx and others, overflowing into the streets. The meeting asked that before bills became law, they should be approved by a public vote, that no individual should own more than $30,000. They asked for an 8-hour day. Also, whereas we are industrious, law-abiding citizens who had paid all taxes and given support and allegiance to the government, resolve that we will in this time of need supply ourselves and our families with proper food and shelter, and we will send our bills to the city treasury to be liquidated until we shall obtain work. In Chicago, 20,000 unemployed marched through the streets to city halls asking bread for the needy, clothing for the naked, and houses for the homeless. Actions like this resulted in some relief for about 10,000 families. In January 1874 in New York City, a huge parade of workers, kept by the police from approaching City Hall, went to Tompkins Square, and there were told by police that they couldn't have a meeting. They stayed and the police attacked. One newspaper reported, police clubs rose and fell. Women and children ran screaming in all directions. Many of them were trampled underfoot in a stampede for the gates. In the street, bystanders were ridden down and mercilessly clubbed by mounted officers. Strikes were called in the textile mills of Fall River, Massachusetts. In the Anthracite Coal District of Pennsylvania, there was the Long Strike, where Irish members of a society called the Ancient Order of Hibernians were accused of acts of violence, mostly on the testimony of a detective planted among the miners. These were the Molly Maguires. They were tried and found guilty. Philip Foner believes, after a study of the evidence, that they were framed because they were labor organizers. He quotes the sympathetic Irish World, which called them intelligent men whose direction gave strength to the resistance of the miners to the inhuman reduction of their wages. And he points to the Miners' Journal, put out by the coal mine owners, which referred to the executed men this way. What did they do? Whenever prices of labor did not suit them, they organized and proclaimed a strike. Altogether, 19 were executed, according to Anthony Bimba, the Molly Maguires. There were scattered protests from working men's organizations, but no mass movement that could stop the executions. It was a time when employers brought in recent immigrants, desperate for work, different from the strikers in language and culture, to break strikes. Italians were imported into the bituminous coal area around Pittsburgh in 1874 to replace striking miners. This led to the killing of 3 Italians, to trials in which jurors of the community exonerated the strikers, and bitter feelings between Italians and other organized workers. The centennial year of 1876, 100 years after the Declaration of Independence, brought forth a number of new declarations reproduced by Philip Foner and We the Other People. Whites and blacks separately expressed their disillusionment. A Negro Declaration of Independence denounced the Republican Party on which they had once depended to gain full freedom, and proposed independent political action by colored voters. And the Working Men's Party of Illinois, at a July 4th celebration organized by German socialists in Chicago, said in its Declaration of Independence, "The present system has enabled capitalists to make laws in their own interest to the injury and oppression of the workers. It has made the name democracy, for which our forefathers fought and died, a mockery and a shadow by giving to property an unproportionate amount of representation and control over legislation. It has enabled capitalists to secure government aid, inland grants, and money loans to selfish railroad corporations who, by monopolizing the means of transportation, are enabled to swindle both the producer and the consumer. It has presented to the world the absurd spectacle of a deadly civil war for the abolition of Negro slavery, while the majority of the white population, those who have created all the wealth of the nation, are compelled to suffer under a bondage infinitely more galling and humiliating. It has allowed the capitalists, as a class, to appropriate annually 5/6 of the entire production of the country. It has therefore prevented mankind from fulfilling their natural destinies on earth, crushed out ambition, prevented marriages, or caused false and unnatural ones, has shortened human life, destroyed morals, and fostered crime, corrupted judges, ministers, and statesmen, shattered confidence, love, and honor among men, and made life a selfish, merciless struggle for existence, instead of a noble and generous struggle for perfection, in which equal advantages should be given to all, and human lives relieved from an unnatural and degrading competition for bread. We therefore, the representatives of the workers of Chicago, in mass meeting assembled, do solemnly publish and declare that we are absolved from all allegiance to the existing political parties of this country, and that as free and independent producers we shall endeavor to acquire the full power to make our own laws, manage our own production, and govern ourselves, acknowledging no rights without duties, no duties without rights. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the assistance and cooperation of all working men, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our means, and our sacred honor. In the year 1877, the country was in the depths of the Depression. That summer, in the hot cities where poor families lived in cellars and drank infested water, the children became sick in large numbers. The New York Times wrote, "Already the cry of the dying children begins to be heard. Soon, to judge from the past, there will be 1,000 deaths of infants per week in the city." That first week in July in Baltimore, where all liquid sewage ran through the streets, 139 babies died. That year, there came a series of tumultuous strikes by railroad workers in a dozen cities. They shook the nation as no labor conflict in its history had done. It began with wage cuts on railroad after railroad in tense situations of already low wages, $1.75 a day for brakemen working 12 hours, scheming and profiteering by the railroad companies, deaths and injuries among the workers, loss of hands, feet, fingers, the crushing of men between cars. At the Baltimore and Ohio station in Martinsburg, West Virginia, workers determined to fight the wage cut went on strike, uncoupled the engines, ran them into the roundhouse, and announced no more trains would leave Martinsburg until the 10% cut was canceled. A crowd of support gathered, too many for the local police to disperse. B&O officials asked the governor for military protection, and he sent in militia. A train tried to get through, protected by the militia, and a striker trying to derail it exchanged gunfire with a militiaman attempting to stop him. The striker was shot in his thigh and his arm. His arm was amputated later that day, and 9 days later he died. 600 freight trains now jammed the yards at Martinsburg. The West Virginia governor applied to newly elected President Rutherford Hayes for federal troops, saying the state militia was insufficient. In fact, the militia was not totally reliable, being composed of many railroad workers. Much of the U.S. Army was tied up in Indian battles in the West. Congress had not appropriated money for the Army yet, but J.P. Morgan, August Belmont, and other bankers now offered to lend money to pay Army officers, but no enlisted men. Federal troops arrived in Martinsburg, and the freight cars began to move. In Baltimore, a crowd of thousands, sympathetic to the railroad strikers, surrounded the armory of the National Guard, which had been called out by the governor at the request of the B&O Railroad. The crowd hurled rocks, and the soldiers came out firing. The streets now became a scene of moving, bloody battle. When the evening was over, 10 men or boys were dead, more badly wounded, 1 soldier wounded. Half of the 120 troops quit, and the rest went on to the train depot, where a crowd of 200 smashed the engine of a passenger train, tore up tracks, and engaged the militia again in running a battle. By now, 15,000 people surrounded the depot. Soon, 3 passenger cars, the station platform, and a locomotive were on fire. The governor asked for federal troops, and Hayes responded. 500 soldiers arrived, and Baltimore quieted down. The rebellion of the railroad workers now spread. Joseph Dacus, then editor of the St. Louis Republican, reported, strikes were occurring almost every hour. The great state of Pennsylvania was in an uproar. New Jersey was afflicted by a paralyzing dread. New York was mustering an army of militia. Ohio was shaken from Lake Erie to the Ohio River. Indiana rested in a dreadful suspense. Illinois, and especially its great metropolis, Chicago, apparently hung on the verge of a vortex of confusion and tumult. St. Louis had already felt the effect of the premonitory strikes of the uprising. Premonitory, excuse me. The strike spread to Pittsburgh and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Again, it happened outside the regular union, pent-up anger exploding without plan. Robert Bruce, historian of the 1877 strikes, writes, 1877, year of violence, about a flagman named Gus Harris. Harris refused to go out on a double-header, a train with 2 locomotives carrying a double length of cars, to which railroads had objected because it required fewer workers and made the brakemen's work more dangerous. The decision was his own, not part of a concerted plan or a general understanding. Had he lain awake that past night, listening to the rain, asking himself if he dared quit, wondering if anyone would join him, weighing the chances? Or had he simply risen to a breakfast that did not fill him, seen his children go off shabby and half-fed, walked brooding through the damp morning, and then yielded impulsively to stored-up rage? When Harris said he would not go, the rest of the crew refused to. The strikers now multiplied, joined by young boys and men from the mills and factories. Pittsburgh had 33 iron mills, 73 glass factories, 29 oil refineries, 158 coal mines. The freight trains stopped moving out of the city. The trainmen's union had not organized this, but it moved to take hold, called a meeting, invited all working men to make common cause with their brethren on the railroad. Railroad and local officials decided that the Pittsburgh militia would not kill their fellow townsmen and urged that Philadelphia troops be called in. By now, 2,000 cars were idle in Pittsburgh. The Philadelphia troops came and began to clear the track. Rocks flew. Gunfire was exchanged between crowd and troops. At least 10 people were killed, all working men, most of them not railroaders. Now the whole city rose in anger. A crowd surrounded the troops who moved into a roundhouse. Railroad cars were set afire, buildings began to burn, and finally the roundhouse itself, the troops marching out of it to safety. There was more gunfire, the Union Depot was set afire, thousands looted the freight cars. A huge grain elevator in a small section of the city went up in flames. In a few days, 24 people had been killed, including 4 soldiers. 79 buildings had been burned to the ground. Something like a general strike was developing in Pittsburgh. Mill workers, car workers, miners, laborers, and the employees at the Carnegie Steel Plant. The entire National Guard of Pennsylvania, 9,000 men, was called out. But many of the companies couldn't move as strikers and other towns held up traffic. In Lebanon, Pennsylvania, one National Guard company mutinied and marched through an excited town. In Altoona, troops surrounded by rioters, immobilized by sabotaged engines, surrendered, stacked arms, fraternized with the crowd, and then were allowed to go home to the accompaniment of singing by a quartet and an all-Negro militia company. In Harrisburg, the state capital, as at so many places, teenagers made up a large part of the crowd, which included some Negroes. Philadelphia militia, on their way home from Altoona, shook hands with the crowd, gave up their guns, marched like captives through the streets, were fed at a hotel and sent home. The crowd agreed to the mayor's request to deposit the surrendered guns at City Hall. Factories and shops were idle. After some looting, citizens' patrols kept order in the streets through the night. Where strikers did not manage to take control, as in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, it may well have been because of disunity. The spokesman of the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company in that town wrote, "The men have no organization, and there is too much race jealousy existing among them to permit them to form one." In Reading, Pennsylvania, there was no such problem. 90% were native-born, the rest mostly German. There, the railroad was 2 months behind in paying wages, and a branch of the Tradesmen Union was organized. 2,000 people gathered, while men who had blackened their faces with coal dust set about methodically tearing up tracks, jamming switches, derailing cars, setting fire to cabooses, and also to a railroad bridge. A National Guard company arrived, fresh from duty at the execution of the Molly Maguires. The crowd threw stones, fired pistols. The soldiers fired into the crowd. 6 men lay dead in the twilight, Bruce reports. A fireman and an engineer formerly employed in the Reading, a carpenter, a huckster, a rolling mill worker, a laborer. A policeman and another man lay at the point of death. 5 of the wounded died. The crowd grew angrier, more menacing. A contingent of soldiers announced it would not fire, one soldier saying he would rather put a bullet through the president of Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron. The 16th Regiment of the Morristown Volunteers stacked its arms. Some militia threw their guns away and gave their ammunition to the crowd. When the guardsmen left for home, federal troops arrived and took control, and local police began making arrests. Meanwhile, the leaders of the big railway brotherhoods, the Order of Railway Conductors, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, the Brotherhood of Engineers, disavowed the strike. There was talk in the press of communistic ideas, widely entertained by the workmen employed in mines and factories by the railroads. In fact, there was a very active working men's party in Chicago with several thousand members, most of them immigrants from Germany and Bohemia. It was connected with the First International in Europe. In the midst of the railroad strikes that summer of 1877, it called a rally. 6,000 people came and demanded nationalization of the railroads. Albert Parsons gave a fiery speech. He was from Alabama, had fought in the Confederacy during the Civil War, married a brown-skinned woman of Spanish and Indian blood, worked as a typesetter, and was one of the best English-speaking orators the Workingmen's Party had. The next day, a crowd of young people, not especially connected with the rally of the evening before, began moving through the railroad yards, closed down the freights, went to the factories, called out the mill workers, the stockyard workers, the crewmen on the Lake Michigan ships, closed down the brickyards and lumber yards. That day also, Albert Parsons was fired from his job with the Chicago Times and declared blacklisted. The police attacked the crowds. The press reported, the sound of clubs falling on skulls was sickening for the first minute until one grew accustomed to it. A rioter dropped at every whack, it seemed, for the ground was covered with them. 2 companies of U.S. infantry arrived, joining National Guardsmen and Civil War veterans. Police fired into a surging crowd, and 3 men were killed. The next day, an armed crowd of 5,000 fought the police. The police fired again and again, and when it was over and the dead were counted, they were, as usual, working men and boys, 18 of them, their skulls smashed by clubs, their vital organs pierced by gunfire. The one city where the Working Men's Party clearly led the rebellion was St. Louis, a city of flour mills, foundries, packing houses, machine shops, breweries, and railroads. Here as elsewhere, there were wage cuts on the railroads, and there were perhaps 1,000 members of the Working Men's Party, many of them bakers, coopers, cabinet makers, cigar makers, brewery workers. The party was organized in 4 sections by nationality: German, English, French, Bohemian. All 4 sections took a ferry across the Mississippi to join a mass meeting of railroad men in East St. Louis. One of their speakers told the meeting, "All you have to do, gentlemen, for you to have the numbers, is to unite on one idea, that the working man shall rule the country. What man makes belongs to him, and the working men made this country." Railroaders in East St. Louis declared themselves on strike. The mayor of East St. Louis was a European immigrant, himself an active revolutionist as a youth, and railroad men's votes dominated the city. In St. Louis itself, the Working Men's Party called an open-air mass meeting to which 5,000 people came. The party was clearly in the leadership of the strike. Speakers, excited by the crowd, became more militant. Capital has changed liberty to serfdom, and we must fight or die. They called for nationalization of the railroads, mines, and all industry. At another huge meeting of the Working Men's Party, a black man spoke for those who worked on the steamboats and levees. He said, "Will you stand to us regardless of color?" The crowd shouted back, "We will." An executive committee was set up, and it called for a general strike of all branches of industry in St. Louis. Handbills for the general strike were soon all over the city. There was a march of 400 Negro steamboat men and roustabouts along the river, 600 factory workers carrying a banner, "No monopoly, working men's rights." A great procession moved through the city, ending with a rally of 10,000 people listening to communist speakers. The people are rising up in their might and declaring that they will no longer submit to being oppressed by unproductive capital. David Burbank, in his book on the St. Louis events, Reign of the Rabble, writes, "Only around St. Louis did the original strike on the railroads expand into such a systematically organized and complete shutdown of all industry that the term general strike is fully justified. And only there did the socialists assume undisputed leadership. No American city has come so close to being ruled by a workers' soviet, as we would now call it, as St. Louis, Missouri in the year 1877. The railroad strikes were making news in Europe. Marx wrote Engels, "What do you think of the workers of the United States? This first explosion against the associated oligarchy of capital, which has occurred since the Civil War, will naturally again be suppressed, but can very well form the point of origin of an earnest workers' party." In New York, several thousand gathered at Tompkins Square. The tone of the meeting was moderate, speaking of a political revolution through the ballot box. And, if you will unite, we may have here within 5 years a socialistic republic. Then will a lovely morning break over this darkened land. It was a peaceful meeting. It adjourned. The last words heard from the platform were, "Whatever we poor men may not have, we have free speech, and no one can take it from us." Then the police charged, using their clubs. In St. Louis, as elsewhere, the momentum of the crowds, the meetings, the enthusiasm could not be sustained. As they diminished, the police, militia, and federal troops moved in, and the authorities took over. The police raided the headquarters of the Working Men's Party and arrested 70 people. The executive committee that had been for a while virtually in charge of the city was now in prison. The strikers surrendered. The wage cuts remained. 131 strike leaders were fired by the Burlington Railroad. When the great railroad strikes of 1877 were over, 100 people were dead, 1,000 people had gone to jail, 100,000 workers had gone on strike, and the strikes had roused into action countless unemployed in the cities. More than half the freight on the nation's 75,000 miles of track had stopped running at the height of the strikes. The railroads made some concessions, withdrew some wage cuts, but also strengthened their coal and iron police. In a number of large cities, National Guard armories were built with loopholes for guns. Robert Bruce believes the strikes taught many people of the hardships of others, and that they led to congressional railroad regulation. They may have stimulated the business unionism of the American Federation of Labor, as well as the national unity of labor proposed by the Knights of Labor and the independent labor farmer parties of the next 2 decades. In 1877, the same year blacks learned that they did not have enough strength to make the real promise of equality in the Civil War, working people learned they were not united enough, not powerful enough, to defeat the combination of private capital and government power. But there was more to come. All right, y'all. That is Chapter 10, The Other Civil War. I don't know about you, but I thought it was a fascinating read. A fascinating read. It looks like it's about to start raining. Actually, it just started raining. So I'm going to see how long the next chapter is and try to get that up today, too. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you're having any issues, let me know if you want me to put these on YouTube. I don't have a YouTube account, but I can make one. Or if I do have one, it's very old. I'll figure it out. But let me know if that would be beneficial, and I'll get these uploaded. Thank you guys for listening. Bye.